we have grown as a political party. That's precisely why we have grown as a political party. And so, look at the difference. Contrast the behavior. Look at Trotman. We take a hammering every day for the oil and gas sector, from Kaicho News and everybody else, or some of the others. But in one press conference, we have answered more policy issues than the APNU AFC did in 5 years of their government on the oil and gas sector. You check if that's not true. In one press conference, we've addressed more issues than they did in 5 years. They signed the agreement, they hid the agreement, they took the signing bonus, the $18 million US, said they thought it was a gift, placed it outside the consolidated fund.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, everybody. So today we're going to be looking at some recent political and economic discussions coming out of Guyana. And we're going to be drawing mostly from a press conference held on March 20th, 2025 by Dr. Bharrat Jagdeo, who is the General Secretary of the People's Progressive Party Civic, or PPPC, one of the two major political forces in Guyana. And we're going to be looking at a transcript of this press conference and trying to pull out some of the key insights and some of the more unexpected things that we found.
Sounds good. Yeah, one of the things that immediately jumped out at me was just the level of political activity that Dr. Jagdeo describes right at the beginning of the press conference. It really kind of paints a picture of a very engaged and maybe even a little theatrical political landscape.
Yeah, theatrical is one way to put it. He goes right into it by outlining what he calls the antics of the opposition. And apparently there's been a bit of a music war brewing with involving AI-generated songs.
Wow.
Between prominent opposition figures, Mr. Norton and Mr. Nigel Hughes, who are both seeking the presidential nomination for the People's National Congress Reform, or PNCR, which is the other major political force in Guyana. And this is a serious point. Dr. Jagdeo raises concerns about racist undertones in some of the lyrics. So, I mean, just right off the bat, you can see how even new technologies like AI are becoming part of this political battle.
Absolutely.
And, there are ethical implications we need to consider.
Yeah, it raises some important questions, I think, about the responsible use of, these digital tools in political campaigns and the need to be vigilant against, any harmful rhetoric, no matter where it comes from.
Yeah, and then it moves into what he terms the bingo war. So we saw competing events in BV, which is a significant community, and Congress Place, which is the PNCR's headquarters. And following that, a flyer war erupted with both times, circulating promises to the electorate. And so let's really kind of focus on those PNCR flyers, because that's where the discussion takes a significant turn towards economic policy.
Right. Yeah, those flyers contain some pretty ambitious proposals that are clearly aimed at addressing a lot of the economic concerns that Guyanese citizens have.
Yeah, exactly. So the PNCR is proposing what they call a guaranteed livable household income. And importantly, they define this as the total money and benefits that a household needs each month to live comfortably without financial worries. So, on the surface, this sounds like it's a very direct response to people's everyday concerns about making ends meet, right?
It is. It definitely is it's addressing this fundamental aspiration for economic security. But I think the crucial question for, everybody listening is how are these promises going to be funded, and what are the potential broader economic consequences?
Exactly. They also promise freeze everywhere, subsidized food and rent, and a really substantial increase in the old age pension to $100,000 Guyanese dollars per month.
Wow.
Which is a huge jump from the current $41,000. And now Dr. Jagdeo raises some really critical points about how feasible these promises actually are.
Right. So what's particularly interesting here, I think, is the critique that he makes, focusing on the underlying economic strategy. The core of his argument seems to be that, these proposals, they heavily emphasize government spending without a clear and credible plan for how the country's going to generate the wealth to actually sustain these expenditures. So I think for you, the listener, this brings to the forefront this challenge that you always see in economic policy, balancing social welfare goals with fiscal responsibility.
Exactly. He's basically saying that it's all about expenditure in these promises, with very little detail on how Guyana's national income will be increased to pay for it all. He even draws a comparison to the economic difficulties that Guyana faced in the 1990s, which is a period that a lot of people remember for significant financial challenges.
Right.
So yeah, this historical reference, I think, serves as a reminder that these kind of ambitious spending plans really need to be rooted in sound economic policies to avoid potential hardship down the line.
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture for you, the listeners, a truly sustainable economic vision requires a really careful equilibrium between government outlays and revenue streams. And so, a disproportionate focus on spending without a well-defined strategy for how to bolster national income can lead to considerable fiscal pressures down the line, which could impact things like inflation and the national debt.
Right. And again, even more specific, he points to examples that he considers to be particularly unrealistic. He mentions Mr. Nigel Hughes proposing the creation of a women's bank and significant road construction, specifically within Georgetown.
Okay, so these more localized proposals, while they might be appealing to specific demographics or regions, they raise questions for you, the listener, about the overall national development strategy. How do these types of proposals fit into a broader vision for the entire country? And are resources being allocated in the most equitable and efficient way to really benefit all Guyanese?
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about youth engagement. So Dr. Jagdeo draws a contrast between the opposition's youth forum that was held at Congress Place, which he estimates drew around 200 attendees, and the PPPC's own youth forums that were held across various regions, where they claim a much larger turnout, something like 15,000 people.
Wow, okay.
And he emphasizes that their gatherings were multi-ethnic. So right away you can see that there's this contrast in numbers that suggests potentially different levels of outreach and support among young people for the two main parties.
Yeah, the scale of engagement definitely provides some insights into the potential reach and mobilization capabilities of each party. And furthermore, the PPPC's emphasis on that multi-ethnic participation is a significant aspect to consider in Guyana's, diverse social and political landscape.
Absolutely. And then he really digs into the PNCR's 2015 manifesto. And he notes that the word youth appeared 24 times. It's accompanied by specific policy proposals, such as creating more jobs for young people, establishing an interministerial task force on youth issues, expanding vocational studies, and creating a special youth fund. However, he contrasts these past promises with what he claims was the reality of youth exclusion from government opportunities during the PNCR's time in office. And he uses a very strong analogy here. He refers to a Kool-Aid moment.
Okay.
Which is, a reference to the Jonestown tragedy, to suggest this sense of disillusionment and being misled. He even shares a brief story about the Darple family's experience. So, this comparison really highlights the importance of looking beyond those stated intentions and examining the actual track record of a political party.
Right. Yeah, the juxtaposition of the manifesto promises with those lived experiences of the people is a really critical lens through which to evaluate a government's effectiveness. And that Kool-Aid analogy, while powerful, aims to really underscore this sense of broken trust and unmet expectations among the youth.
Yeah, and on the other hand, the PPPC presents a very different picture regarding youth engagement. They highlight their historical track record of including young people in leadership positions, pointing to the fact that, the current president is relatively young, and citing examples of ministers who were appointed in their 20s. So this suggests, a contrasting approach where the PPPC is emphasizing its commitment to empowering younger generations through that active participation in governance.
Yeah, this focus on historical and current youth representation aims to project an image of a party that not only values young people, but also actively integrates them into the decision-making processes. So it's a key part of their narrative.
Right. Moving on to the very crucial issue of job creation, Dr. Jagdeo references a statement, an alleged statement by former President Granger, indicating that it wasn't the government's responsibility to create jobs, along with a comment about pepper sauce that became somewhat controversial. And he contrasts this with the PPPC's claim of having created 60,000 jobs and their own part-time job initiative. So we have two very distinct philosophies here about the government's role in the economy and in supporting employment.
Yeah, the differing perspectives on the government's role in fostering employment are pretty stark. The PPPC's active involvement through job creation programs stands in pretty stark contrast to what they portray as a more hands-off approach from the previous administration.
Right, and he points to specific actions taken by the previous government that he says negatively impacted workers. He mentions the dismissal of sugar workers and Amerindians, as well as the removal of the Because We Care grant, which was a financial assistance program for families with school-aged children. So I think these examples are intended to illustrate the tangible consequences of policy decisions on the lives of ordinary Guyanese citizens.
Yeah, without a doubt, those actions would have had some pretty significant socioeconomic repercussions for the affected communities. And they serve as concrete examples in the PPPC's narrative of contrasting their policies with the opposition's.
Right. So I think to kind of summarize the PPPC's overarching argument, they're portraying the opposition's current pronouncements as essentially empty political slogans that lack a sound and believable plan. They continuously emphasize the importance of a proven track record and the ability to keep promises. To that end, they contrast what they claim was the PNCR's failure to deliver on their 2015 manifesto promises with the PPPC's assertion that they have fulfilled 90% of their 2020 manifesto commitments.
Wow.
Within the first 3 years, and are on track for full completion this year, specifically mentioning things like free university education, increases in pensions, and the reinstatement of the children's grant. So this really highlights this central theme in political campaigns, this battle for credibility based on past actions and future pledges.
Yeah, this strategic emphasis on past performance and the degree of manifesto fulfillment is a really common tactic that's used to build trust and demonstrate competence to the electorate.
Exactly. Now let's talk about a specific promise in the PNCR's flyer, a proposed 35% increase in government salaries.
Okay.
And Dr. Jagdeo raises a crucial point of ambiguity here. Is this a 35% increase per year, or is it spreading over a 5-year period?
Right.
And then he goes on to highlight the potentially enormous financial implications, suggesting that if it were an annual increase, it could consume the entirety of Guyana's oil revenues. So this lack of clarity really underscores the need to carefully examine the details and the potential financial sustainability of any major policy proposal.
Yeah, the absence of specifics on such a significant economic commitment is a cause for concern. The potential fiscal consequences really do underscore the importance of responsible financial planning and, transparent communication when making promises that could have such a substantial impact on the national budget.
Exactly. And so in contrast to the opposition's proposals, Dr. Jagdeo outlines the PPPC's stated goals for the future.
Okay.
These include facilitating homeownership for all Guyanese, establishing first-world standards in healthcare and education, including free university, providing opportunities for training and retraining, diversifying the economy beyond oil and gas, enhancing national security through technology, improving access to banking services, and creating investment opportunities for all Guyanese. And he points to the current growth in the non-oil sectors of the economy.
Okay.
So this really paints a picture of a very broad and ambitious vision for national development, addressing various aspects of social and economic well-being.
These objectives represent a pretty comprehensive vision for Guyana's future, touching on crucial areas like social welfare, economic expansion, and public infrastructure. The focus on economic diversification is especially vital for ensuring long-term stability and resilience in the face of, those potential fluctuations in the oil market.
Exactly. He also discusses the PPPC's approach to taxation, describing it as family-friendly.
Okay.
And emphasizing their efforts to allow individuals to retain more of their income, referencing policies related to second jobs and overtime pay. He also highlights the very significant increase in the national budget allocated to education.
Okay.
So these measures signal a policy direction aimed at directly benefiting households, incentivizing work, and investing in the country's human capital through education.
Yeah, these tax policies and budgetary allocations indicate a very deliberate strategy to support working families, encourage economic activity, and prioritize investment in the education sector as a foundation for future development.
Yeah. And then he goes on to kind of critique the opposition's slogans like livable wage and good life. And he argues that these terms are very vague and potentially meaningless without concrete definitions. And he uses some really colorful analogies. He compares them to simply saying beer or trying to differentiate between wine and white rum, suggesting a lack of real substance or clear understanding. So this raises a critical point about the language of politics. How do you evaluate promises that lack specific measurable goals.
Right. The use of those analogies effectively highlights the challenge of interpreting and implementing such broad and undefined slogans. It really does prompt a closer examination of whether these phrases represent, genuine policy proposals or simply aspirational statements without a clear pathway to realization.
Exactly. And he also digs into this concept of people-centered development.
Okay.
He argues that the previous government's interpretation of this disproportionately benefited government ministers and their families, citing examples such as very significant salary increases for ministers, access to medical care abroad, the purchase of very expensive vehicles, and a generous per diem policy. So, this raises important questions about fairness.
It does.
And equity and potential conflicts of interest in governance.
Yeah, this critique of the previous administration's approach to people-centered development brings to the forefront those critical issues of resource allocation and accountability in government. It really does suggest a potential disparity between the stated intentions and the actual outcomes.
Right. And in contrast, Dr. Jagdeo asserts that the PPPC's vision of friends and family encompasses the entire country. He points to examples such as new contractors being awarded government projects, including young Afro-Guyanese individuals, increased numbers of new homeowners, and recipients of government scholarships as evidence of a much broader distribution of opportunities. He also mentions ongoing efforts to improve the effectiveness of the GOAL scholarship program. So this presents a very contrasting narrative where the ruling party claims that its policies benefit a much wider segment of the population.
Yeah, this counter-narrative attempts to portray the PPPC as a party that prioritizes the well-being and advancement of all Guyanese citizens. And they're using these specific examples to really support their claim of inclusive development.
And on the very contentious topic of government contracts and accusations of the PPPC favoring friends and family, Dr. Jagdeo references an alleged situation during the previous administration where the wife of a minister supposedly received contracts within her own ministry. So again, this highlights this persistent challenge of ensuring transparency.
It does.
And preventing that potential for nepotism in the awarding of government contracts, regardless of which party is in power.
Right, yeah. If that example were substantiated, it would further bolster the PPPC's critique of the previous government's practices regarding the allocation of state resources and those potential conflicts of interest.
Right. Dr. Jagdeo then reiterates the PPPC's long-standing vision for a unified, multi-ethnic Guyana. And he contrasts this with what he claims is the opposition's history of exploiting those ethnic divisions for political gain. He emphasizes the PPPC's ongoing efforts to combat the label of being a racist party and points to the visible multi-ethnic composition within their own party structures. So, in a nation as diverse as Guyana, this really underscores the critical importance of fostering national unity and addressing those historical ethnic tensions in a constructive way.
In Guyana's multi-ethnic society, the issue of national unity is paramount. The PPPC's consistent emphasis on multi-ethnicity and their active efforts to counter accusations of racial bias are really central to their political messaging and their attempts to build that broad-based support.
Right. And then expanding on their vision for the future, Dr. Jagdeo specifically outlines the PPPC's goals for young people. These include access to better-paying jobs, opportunities for training and improved health care, the possibility of home ownership, access to leisure activities, enhanced personal security, and the ongoing improvements in national infrastructure, such as online banking systems. And the airport card system even shares a little story about a Guyanese migrant who returned home and found Guyana to be both safe and economically attractive. So this really paints a picture of a future where young Guyanese have greater opportunities and a better quality of life.
Yeah, this comprehensive vision for Guyana's youth addresses many of the key aspirations of younger generations and aims to create a positive outlook for their future under the current administration. That personal anecdote adds a layer of relatability and reinforces the idea of Guyana as a desirable place to live and work.
Right. And then turning to a direct comparison of track records, Dr. Jagdeo contrasts the PPPC's claimed achievements with what he characterizes as the APNU plus AFCs, the coalition that the PNCR led in government, profligacy, waste, and ineptitude. And he uses some very strong language here. He even referred to them metaphorically as a dodo party.
Wow.
It as being like cardboard cutouts, implying a lack of substance and effectiveness. He also highlights the different approaches to the agriculture sector, noting the current minister Zulfikar Mustafa's very active engagement with farmers compared to the alleged lack of engagement by the previous minister. So, this stark contrast in descriptions is intended to create a very clear distinction between the two parties in terms of their competence and effectiveness in governance.
Yeah, the direct comparison of past performance is such a fundamental aspect of electoral competition, and the use of, such strong rhetoric and those very specific examples related to key sectors like agriculture aims to create a very vivid contrast in the minds of voters regarding the two parties' capabilities and priorities.
Right. And then he moves on to the very critical oil and gas sector. He emphasizes the PPPC's commitment to transparency, citing what he claims are over 100 press conferences held on the issue.
Okay.
The sharing of detailed information, the renegotiated production sharing agreement, or PSA, which now includes corporate tax and a higher royalty rate for Guyana, the establishment of a modern legal framework for the sector, and the transparent management of the Natural Resource Fund, or NRF, which he notes has been praised by the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. And he very sharply contrasts this with the previous government's handling of the sector, particularly the secrecy surrounding the initial agreement with ExxonMobil, and the fact that the signing bonus received was initially held outside of the consolidated fund. So we have these two fundamentally different approaches here to managing Guyana's most significant natural resource, one emphasizing openness and the other being criticized for its lack of transparency.
Yeah, the stark contrast in how the two administrations have approached the management of the oil and gas sector, particularly concerning transparency and the fiscal terms of the agreements, is a really crucial point of differentiation for the electorate. The PPPC is clearly trying to position themselves as the more responsible and accountable steward of this vital national asset.
And comparing policies within the mining sector, he points to what he describes as the damage inflicted on the sector under the previous government. He mentions job losses for bauxite workers and small miners, as well as increased taxes and restrictions. And he highlights the PPPC's actions to remove those restrictions. He also references the ongoing issue of gold smuggling and mentions reports from the United States that allegedly indicated higher levels of such illegal activity during the APNU plus AFC's time in office. So again, this comparison illustrates how government policies can have such a direct impact on specific industries and the livelihoods of the people who work in them.
Right, that focus on specific sectors like mining allows for a more granular evaluation of the two parties' policy impacts on employment and economic activity at a local level. And the issue of gold smuggling also raises these important questions about regulatory oversight and enforcement.
Right. And Dr. Jagdeo underscores his belief that the upcoming elections will ultimately be about trust and the electorate's assessment of which party is more likely to keep its promises. And he repeatedly refers back to the PPPC's claimed track record of delivery versus what he portrays as the opposition's history of unfulfilled promises. So this emphasizes that fundamental role of trust and credibility in the relationship between political parties and the voters they seek to represent.
Ultimately, elections are often a referendum on trust. That consistent emphasis on past performance and the ability to deliver on those commitments will likely be a central theme in the lead up to the next election cycle.
Right. And turning to some more recent activities, Dr. Jagdeo addresses the opposition's protest at the Square of the Revolution concerning the detention of Ms. Atwell. And he's very quick to point out that the PPPC government has no control over the actions of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, in the United States. So this highlights the complexities of these international legal and diplomatic matters and the limitations of a domestic government's authority in those situations.
Yeah, that underscores the distinction between domestic political issues and the actions of foreign government agencies over which the Guyanese government has no direct control.
Right. He also comments on a recent statement made by the Alliance for Change, or AFC, which is a smaller party in the opposition coalition regarding Venezuela, calling it disgusting. And he contrasts this with what he considers a more mature stance taken by Mr. Norton, and also references a statement from the G7 foreign ministers, supporting Guyana's sovereignty in its ongoing border controversy with Venezuela. So this highlights the sensitivity of that border issue and the importance of a unified national stance on these matters of territorial integrity.
The strong reaction to the AFC's statement really underscores the significance of the Guyana-Venezuela border dispute and the need for a consistent and unified national position, which has, obviously garnered international support.
Okay. Now, addressing those recent allegations made by the Mohammeds, and particularly their claim that the government instructed them to declare their gold holdings, Dr. Jagdeo presents a very strong counter-argument. He states that, buying and possessing undeclared gold is illegal under Guyanese law, thus framing the call to declare as not an instruction from the government, but rather an indictment on their own potential illegal activities. He also briefly mentions checks done by the Village Voice newspaper and the involvement of the Attorney General in this matter. So, for you, the listener, this delves into a very specific legal and financial issue with a PPPC offering a very clear legal justification for its actions and questioning the narrative presented by the Mohammeds.
Yeah, this addresses a very specific legal matter concerning financial regulations and transparency in the gold sector, the PPPC's perspective. Expert speaker.